Robert E. Lee, Gallant Christian Soldier, by Lee Roddy, Chapter 10. Gray line grows thin. Shortages were beginning to hurt the entire South. Needs were especially painful in the Army of Northern Virginia as 1864 began. Provisions for the men, too, are very scarce. Lee wrote Mary after noting there were no forage for the horses. The soldiers, not the army, owned the animals they rode. There was little money for guns and none for hay, even if it had been available. Some soldiers had been without shoes the previous winter. Now it was worse. One division reported that more than 400 men were barefoot. More than 1,000 were without blankets. Lee wrote, "With very light diet and light clothing, I fear they will suffer, but still they are cheerful and uncomplaining." The Virginia soldiers prepared huts for themselves or whatever they could find, or spent the winter in ragged tents, now showing signs of a long, hard war. Things were not going well, especially in Tennessee, where Longstreet had been sent against Grant. Lincoln's only winning general had racked up victories in Chickamauga and Chattanooga. If there was nothing but bad news from the military standpoint in early 1864, Lee had reason to feel better about the spiritual condition of his troops. Revival was sweeping the ranks. Reverend B.T. Lacey, who had been Stonewall Jackson's chaplain, came in with Chaplain J. William Jones to see Lee. Lee greeted them that February 6th and listened to their report. "A great revival has extended through the camps and is bringing thousands of our noble men to Christ," Jones reported. Chaplain Jones saw Lee's dark eyes brighten and his whole countenance glow with pleasure. The chaplain felt the whole tent was warmed by Lee's favorable response. The next day, Lee issued a general order. Noting he had already called for proper observance of the Sabbath, the commanding general was now repeating the order on the subject. Lee was pleased that many brigades had erected convenient houses of worship, but he ordered all duties stopped on the Sabbath for men and animals except where absolutely necessary. On the military front, shortage of provisions and news of a new Union general for the Army of the Potomac made Lee thoughtful. In January, Lee wrote the Secretary of War that a regular supply of provisions to the troops in this army is a matter of great importance. When they were hungry, the men suffered morale loss. Desertions were becoming more frequent. Lee added, "Unless there is a change, I fear the army cannot be kept together." The northern newspapers carried stories that Lincoln had finally found a Union officer who would win in the field. Lincoln personally made Grant a lieutenant general with authority over all Union troops everywhere. Lee was still only in charge of Virginia's forces. By March 25th, Lee had guessed Grant's intentions. "I now know that the first important effort will be directed against Richmond," Lee wrote Davis. Lee knew Grant and had seen him operate in Mexico. Lee quickly figured that Grant would take action against Longstreet, now in the West. "It behooves us to be on the alert," Lee wrote Longstreet, "or we will be deceived. You know that is part of Grant's tactics." Longstreet, slow to fight, was also slow to understand the military skills of Lincoln's new general. "I do not think that he is any better than Pope," Longstreet told Lee in April. "His chief strength is his prestige." Lee knew better. In a conversation with a colonel, Lee said Grant and Meade would be a tough combination, yet Lee was not discouraged. "Colonel, we have to whip them. We must whip them, and it has already made me feel better to think of it." Lee flashed a smile. The winter snows were gone from the fields. Signs of spring meant the beginning of another hard season of battles. Grant and Lee clashed first at the Wilderness Campaign. Lincoln had upward of 65,000 men. Grant was believed to have 100,000 troops. The Union leader was west of Fredericksburg, slicing south to cut the heart out of the Confederacy at Richmond. Always an offensive fighter who carried the battle to the enemy, Lee struck first. in the battle of May 5th to 7th, wounded and dead soon sprawled in horrible mounts. Nearby plantation mansions became bloody, smelly hospital where men moaned and died. A Union trooper storming through the wilderness wrote of the untended, wounded, and ungathered dead. They lay, he recorded, thick in the jungle of scrub oaks, pines, and underbrush, through which we rushed upon them. The area caught fire, and flames raced through the brush with such intensity and speed that neither north nor south could help the man who could not move out of the inferno on his own. Grant's counterattack against Lee's initial onslaught was blunted. Lee's Confederates defeated the Union left flank, turned back on the center, and slowed the right. Union generals Burnside and Hooker retreated under a devastating pounding, but Grant was made of sterner stuff. He pulled back from wilderness where dry vines, trees, and shrubs still burned. The air was hideous with the cries of trapped, wounded, and dying men on both sides, but Grant was not retreating. He slipped off to the east, a little closer to Fredericksburg, but then turned south again towards Richmond, skirting Lee's forces. Lee's uncanny ability to predict his opposing general's next move prompted Lee to place Confederate troops at Spotsylvania, where he figured Grant would reappear. Lee waited, knowing he was finally up against a determined, tough-minded Union officer who wanted to win. The price was not as important as victory. Lee had now lost the services of Longstreet. As usual, Longstreet had been slow in coming up with his troops at Wilderness. His men began calling his tendency the Slows. But he would not fight again for a long time. A shot fired by his own men hit Longstreet high in the chest, at the throat. It seemed to be a fatal wound, but Longstreet lived. 2 of Lee's top 5 generals were out of action. Jackson dead, Longstreet badly wounded. The third fell on May 12th. Word came to Lee that his dashing cavalry officer, Jeb Stuart, had been wounded in the stomach as he faced Philip Sheridan at Yellow Tavern. A short time later, an officer entered Lee's tent and told him Stuart was dead. "I can scarcely think of him without weeping," Lee said, when the officer came upon the general a few minutes later. He wrote Mary that a more zealous, ardent, brave, and devoted soldier than Stuart the Confederacy cannot have. Praise be to God for having sustained him to us so far. Lee himself barely escaped death in the bitter fighting. Grant, the Hammerer, threw his assault troops on the Confederates' prepared breastworks known as the First Mule Shoe and later as Bloody Angle. The South's fortifications were shaped like a U or a V with the open end to the south. Grant had determined to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer. He wanted his men to take the great mounds of dirt. On the day Stuart died, the most remarkable musketry fire of war pounded the earthworks. Taylor, on Lee's personal staff, recorded that the lines released such hissing fire that there was an incessant, terrific hail of deadly missiles. It was so bad that no living man nor thing could stand in the doomed space embraced within those angry lines. Even large trees were felled, their trunks cut in twain by the bullets of small arms. The Spotsylvania battle lasted 12 terrible days. Death repeatedly reached out for General Lee, but never quite touched him. The usually steady traveler suddenly reared as heavy artillery fire opened in front of him. He reared just as a solid shot passed under his belly, missing Lee's boot heel and embedding in the ground. God had spared Lee again. Lee was riding forward when he found his men running in great disorder. He raised himself in the stirrups and called to them, "Shame on you, men! Shame on you! Go back to your regiments!" The men continued their headlong flight, panicked out of all reason by the fury of Union fire. Lee moved toward the battle they were leaving in such fear. General Gordon, riding with Lee, saw that the general rode majestically in front of my line of battle. Lee's head was uncovered, and he looked a very god of war. Realizing that Lee intended to lead the men back into battle, Gordon spurred his mount up beside the big gray. "General Lee," Gordon said firmly, but so low the soldiers could not hear, "you shall not lead my men in charge. No man can do that, sir." Gordon gently blocked Traveler with his own horse while explaining to Lee that there were Carolinians and Virginians in the gray ranks behind him. "They have never failed you on any field," Gordon said with feeling, "and they will not fail you here." His voice had risen. The men overheard. "No!" the men cried. "No! They had not failed Marse Robert. They would not fail him wrong now." Gordon was firm. "General Lee, this is no place for you. Go back, General. We will drive them." Soldiers gathered around Lee. Some turned Traveler with his bridle, then hanging onto the bridle and stirrups, some pushing against the horse. The men seemed literally to be pulling their general to safety. Gently, Lee brought the big gray head back toward the enemy. The other men cheered, but those closest to Lee again grabbed the bridle and tried to turn the horse toward safety. An attack commenced, spilling lead all around them. The men intensified their cries for Lee to go back. "If you will promise to drive these people from our works," Lee said gently, "I will go back." They kept their word after Lee moved back. Another time, disorganized troops fell back where Lee sat on Traveler. He called to General McGowan, "Is this splendid brigade of yours running like a flock of geese?" General McGowan assured Lee the men were not whipped. They only want a place to form, and they will fight as well as ever they did. Many balls whizzed around Lee. He saw 3 Texas regiments moving forward across deadly open ground. Lee turned Traveler around and waved his hat. "Hooray for Texas! Hooray for Texas!" As the newcomers rushed by, acknowledging their general's tribute, he called after them to give the Union the cold steel. He shouted, "They will stand and fire all day and never move unless you charge them." A soldier recorded, "Never before in my life did I ever witness such a scene as was enacted when Lee pronounced those words." A yell rent in the air that must have been heard for miles around. Tears slid down the cheeks of a veteran courier at the scene. He exclaimed, "I would charge hell itself for that old man." The general tried to move toward the battle, but the Texans cried that they would not advance until Lee turned back. Colonel Venable, Lee's aide, moved up beside Lee and pointed out that reinforcements had come up. Lee turned Traveler's head away from the battle. The cheering Texans moved on to fight. They made the Union soldiers in the underbrush aware of their power by inflicting heavy casualties. Grant's troops reeled and fell back under rebel attack. The inspired rebels wrestled another victory from the Union, but it was not the kind of triumph the South needed, for Grant again slipped away, but not in retreat. He had set his eyes on Richmond, and nothing could shake him from that goal except death, his own death. Lee, who knew this opponent as he did the previous ones, said that Grant had an iron will. Lee realized Grant was as persistent a man as would continue to deliver constant and heavy blows. Furthermore, Lee explained, Grant was in so solidly with the Union government that he could command to any extent its limitless resources in men and materials, while the Confederacy was always practically exhausted in both. Lee predicted, however, that the Union could not long continue the heavy losses they were sustaining. Lee was right. When Grant had suffered an incredible 60,000 casualties that broke off the direct attack on Richmond, he skirted east and drove south towards Cold Harbor.